Something I thought it would be fun to talk about is the way a lot of guitar players approach scales, and in many cases I think they're approaching them wrong. I think the danger is that a scale is an easy thing to teach, it's an easy thing to learn, and it's a very easy way to measure your progress in terms of how many different shapes do you know and how fast can you play them. And certainly in the past I've met a lot of students who started out as great blues players and then became unmusical shredders because they were looking for the wrong solutions within these scale shapes. And I guess the danger is when you learn a new scale and you just play as fast as you can on each string and then move on to the next string, and it's almost like the scale is telling you what to play rather than you owning the scale. And counterintuitively, I think the solution is to slow down. You have to learn the sound of each note. Every note in any scale you can think of has a unique character, has something special to bring to the harmonic backdrop over which you are playing. And it's a hard thing for guitar players to do. We want to be faster than the other guy, and we are mostly guys, let's be frank. But I think the way I teach people modes now, scales, is probably more conducive to musical end results. So if a blues player comes to me now and they go, I don't want to ruin that because there's something vaguely musical about it, and I'd hate to turn it into because then there's no music there anymore, there's just the trick. So now I would say, okay, if you want to learn the Dorian mode, keep this stuff. That's good, that's your skeleton. And now, instead of flipping a switch and going from pentatonic mode into the Dorian mode, now it's more like a dimmer switch or a fader, and you can introduce the character of that mode gradually. So if you have that as your template, and then that's 5/7 of the Dorian mode anyway. All you need to make it fully Dorian is to add this note and that note in every octave. And the fun thing about that now is you can be slightly Dorian just by using these as embellishments. And it's still recognisably a blues lick, but with a hint of that Thin Lizzy twiddle added to it. Or you could draw more attention to those notes. And then maybe even eliminate some of the neighbouring pentatonic notes to make it sound more fusion, more angular, and you've got... And if it gets too weird, you know where the pentatonic shape is, it will save you, it's here. So normal bluesy stuff. If you start treating all the modes like that, you'll find 3 of them fit into a minor pentatonic shape really nicely, 3 fit into a major shape really nicely, and the other one is horrible. Unless you want to play over that chord for 16 bars. The thing I get asked about quite a lot is how do I use chromatic notes, how do I play outside? And I think one thing that's important to remember, you need to like the sound of chromatic playing and outside playing before you try and do it. You can't just do it because some other guy on the internet told you you're inadequate for not being able to do it. And the other thing to bear in mind is if you know the blues scale, you've probably used some chromatic notes in the most musical way possible without realizing that that's what you were doing. If you look at the minor pentatonic scale, and then you look at what we call the blues scale, which has this extra note, it's kind of the worst note in the world. If you land on that, you're hurting people. Really, really jarring note. And yet most of us know blues licks where we can use it in context, so it's an ornament to add a certain funkiness to the fifth or indeed the fourth. It's not meant to be a melodic note in its own right. It's meant to add a certain feel to the more correct sounding notes that live either side of it. If you can do that, then in theory you know everything you need to know to use any one of the 12 notes at any point over any chord, so long as you use it responsibly. And I think the main things are to play it safe. If you follow every chromatic, jarring sounding note with another good note that's not too far away from it melodically, if you can just step up a semitone and magically you're playing a note that's in the chord, that suddenly justifies the shocking note you played a millisecond ago. And the other thing that makes you sound even more confident is if you can arrange the notes in such a way that the good note lands in a more important part of the beat. And these are things you can't be too conscious of these things when you play. But if you're listening to what you do, then trial and error, along with trying to feel responsible for the notes you play, should result in that same end product. The chromatic notes going where they're most welcome, and the more melodic notes falling in the stronger places within the pulse of the music. So there are a few ways you could approach this. You might look at the pentatonic scale and fill in the gaps. Or something like that makes sense because you've got all these chromatic notes in a row, but the highest one and the lowest one are right, so the listener will forgive any anomalies they hear in between. Or you could maybe go right back to first principles and say, I'm going to use the notes that are in the chord, and that will be my template. So, I don't know. And then look at where the chromatic approach notes live relative to that shape. Huh? And something like that, there are some horrendously wrong notes in there, but because they're jutted right up against a chord tone, you're immune from criticism up to a point. And that seems to be how that works, or my personal favourite. It's the idea of the chord tones being the skeleton, and then you flesh it out with chromatic approach notes. And when people talk about playing outside, I think that's the same thing, but you zoom out, you look at the same concept from further away. So instead of one wrong note leading up to a right note, it's a wrong key for a while leading into a right key. Same principles apply. If you can get lost but then somehow land on your feet without the melody jumping too far, and with the first nice note happening somewhere important within the pulse of the music, you sound cool rather than wrong. I find it interesting that you can use every single one of the notes in the chromatic scale, and the listener will still know what chord you're implying. There must have been all 12 notes in there, but hopefully it sounds suitably like B minor rather than F major or something. It's where you put the notes, not what the notes are, that I think is the most important thing. So for our next adventure, I'd like to talk about a popular arpeggio I played on one of my songs, a wonderful slippery thing, and I can never play it, especially with you watching me, but it's this, that kind of idea. I know a lot of people prefer to do their arpeggios with a sweep picking thing, and that kind of sound, and for me it's a little bit too abrasive and percussive, and maybe because I've listened to so many sax players, I like an arpeggio to sound as fluid and liquid and bubbly as possible without too much of that. So I've kind of worked out a system that works for me, and you can apply it to a variety of arpeggios. And the basic concept is to ask yourself, how many different notes are there in this arpeggio? and then you try and play all of them once on one string. So fill up a space just slightly less than an octave with all the notes that are available. So if I were to play the humble minor arpeggio, there's only 3 notes, so I'll play those, and then I've used up that string. If I try to play any more notes, I'm cheating. And then the idea is to use that same shape on different strings. You might consider it cheating. I think of it as the way piano players approach arpeggios. A lot of times they'll memorize a simple kind of 1 octave shape, and then they'll just hop effortlessly up to the next octave as many times as they need. So if you listen to the insane kind of 20 octave arctatum arpeggios, I think there must be some logic like that. It's one basic shape repeating. So that's a simple example of it. Now, if you're not used to playing like this, the big challenges are, number 1, hammering with your index finger. Generally, this is nature's capo, and all it does for most of its life is just stay there, barred. And this is maybe a little bit weird if you don't do it, but you get used to it pretty quickly. And so you might just check that that comes out. And then, when you move on to the next string, the logical thing is to hop onto the D string and move up 2 frets, and then all the notes are the same. Your shape still works. But it's probably worth slowing down at that point. I find if there's a note that's likely to throw you, it's a really good idea just to stop after you've played that note, and then you make it a feature. You're kind of looking forward to the note that's most likely to trip you up. And your goal is just to hide the join, so that just sounds like 4 notes on one string. And once you can do that, that's not any harder. And obviously the arpeggio still isn't big enough. We want more. So you can either hop onto the B string and go up another 3 frets, or, which I like to do, go back to the top E string, and back to where you were. So now you've got one shape working pretty hard for you. You've got every note between there and there. You're not repeating any, you're not skipping any. It gets more fun when you start to complicate things and add some extra notes. So I might, for instance, want to have a minor 7th arpeggio, in which case I could maybe add the 7th there. Exactly the same idea, except this time this hand is doing a bit more work, kind of stretchy. Elbow down, wrist straight, thumb down. If you need the neck of the guitar up here by your nose, so be it. All that matters is that it sounds good. So exactly the same principle, or I could do it for a major 7th arpeggio, or I could go for something like this. It's kind of an unusual arpeggio that you don't hear every day, but it's no harder for your hand to execute than the humble minor 7th arpeggio. For any of these, all you really need is the shape on one string, and then the shifting protocol is the same. So for B major 7th, so it's there, 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 and then the same thing here. It might be worth really focusing on the shift between the end of one string and the start of the next. Because the last thing in the world you want is, 2 notes ringing, or something like that. As soon as you kick on the distortion, it's an ungainly sound. It spoils the whole monophonic appeal of a lick like this. You might even check that you're comfortable with that thing, where every time one finger goes down, the other one releases. I think the main thing that throws people when they're descending in pitch is this kind of assumption that you can do the hammer on backwards. And like if hitting the string really hard gives you a note, then removing your finger really hard should give you another note, and it doesn't. I think when you're coming down, your tapping hand has to act like a pick. You can test that just by having all the fingers lined up and then tell yourself you want to hear the 10th fret on the E string and see if you can get a really loud, convincing note. I'm deliberately doing this with a clean sound, even though it's harder. You could even try different dynamics. You could try to check you can do it soft and do it loud. Then when you kick in all the distortion and the gain, generally the best policy is to hit these notes as hard as you can. They will still sound fluid because you're not picking them. But if you play too softly, then all the background noise, the handling noise, will devour the notes that you're trying to communicate to people. Huh? So the more confident you can make those notes sound, the more assertive the pull-offs are. This time round, I'd like to show you some stuff based on the bridge section, or the chorus section, if you will, from a tune called Sevens on my Erotic Cakes album. And it's this kind of thing. But I'd like to kind of simplify it a bit and hopefully make it more useful for what you might do in your own music. The genesis of that lick was trying to find a new way to play a major seventh arpeggio. And I started out by looking at it 2 notes per string. I guess with E flat major 7, so I'd start there. So you've got that network of notes, and you're doing this the whole time, which is always fun. And then I figured it might be interesting to split that up. So for each string, my tapping hand is doing the higher note and the regular fretting hand is doing the lower note. So that then gave me and then I thought, okay, if the notes are split up like that, then I don't have to play them in order anymore, and I can get more of a sequence rather than just highest note to the lowest note. And I thought, wonder what that will sound like. And you don't really get that sound any other way. Every note is on a fresh string. So if you experiment with how long the fingertips spend on their allotted note, you can get a really staccato sound or more of a solid. So one of the main things is to make sure you're hammering as hard as possible, especially with this rubbish finger, which is God's little joke at our expense. 3.5 fingers on each hand, but the more confidently you can hit those, the better this stuff will sound. So I'm using, because I'm weird, I've got the pick tucked away in the index finger the whole time, because I never know when there might be an emergency and I might need to pick a note, so it's just there. So I'm using the 2nd and 4th fingers on that hand, and indeed on this hand. Now I have the string damper there. Often I forget to put it on. So to just keep the noise to a minimum, I'm using index finger just as a blank. It's just resting lightly on those strings. And I'm just hammering again with the 4th finger and the 2nd finger. So that's the basic shape there. You might want to check that you can do that. And then if we move on to the next set of strings, there's a similar thing. Now I'd be using the 2nd and 3rd fingers. So exactly the same idea, but now the notes are that. It's a 4th interval instead of a 5th with each hand. And then you can move down to here. For some reason, I now use the second and third fingers on this hand. I think so that I can remember my bearings, and if I have to go back to the top string, I don't have to readjust too much. The wrist position hasn't changed too drastically. And with this hand, it's still the fourth finger and the second finger, purely for anti-noise reasons. So we've now got a whole arpeggio that looks like that. You could continue, it gets a bit hairy there, because you've got two fingers on the same fret tapping different strings. And it's a bit of a tap dance there. You have to hammer this note and then get it right out of the way when this finger comes on, otherwise they'll collide with each other. And generally a finger is fatter than the distance between two strings, so it will end in tears if you're not careful. But you can see how the pattern would repeat until you run out of strings. Now, before I turn that into the actual lick from sevens, which is not important because that already exists, that's mine. You need to come up with yours. It's interesting to have a look at all the different stuff you can do just by moving one hand up or down. Because you're just playing two notes of the arpeggio in terms of musical formula with this hand, and the other two notes with this hand. So I've got the root and the fifth there, and then the third and the seventh there. So I could move this hand down a fret, and it's a minor seventh now, or I could move it up and get this suspended sound. It's just one motor skill, and if you've trained your fingers to do that and they're in time and the notes are all loud, you might as well see how much mileage you can get out of that basic technique. Here's the final version of this idea in my world. This is as far as I took it. And the real twist here is because my tune is in a 7/4 time signature, hence the imaginative name. It kind of starts going down and then it reverses back on itself a little bit and then continues going back down. So it's the highest pair of strings, then the middle, then the highest again, then the middle, then the lowest, then the middle, and then the lowest again. For this instalment, I thought it would be fun to show you a little extract from one of the tunes on the Aristocrats album, which may or may not be out and available for purchase by the time you read and or watch this. It's from a tune called Bad Asteroid, and it's actually something that's been bubbling away in my collection of unused tunes for about 18, 19 years. And finally I got an excuse to record it properly, and yeah, it's called Bad Asteroid. Look up the Aristocrats if you want to know more about this. But the section I wanted to show you today, I thought you'd find interesting because there's some wacky tapping ideas, but also there's some harmonic interest. There's some budget Steely Dan kind of chords going on in the background. So if you just play the lick on its own, it doesn't mean anything. It sounds weird. You need the chords there for context. So I guess I'll start by showing you what the chords are. Okay, so here are the chords. Starts with that, so it's kind of a C triad, but you've got a B flat in the bass, so you might think of it as a B flat Lydian vibe, which ends up there. And there's an A with a B in the bass, so you might, or probably do, think of that as a B11th kind of sound. And that's kind of fun. Every finger moves up one fret apart from the one on the B string. And I guess now it's a nice dominant ninth in the key of C. then something like that. It's essentially an F major 7. Sometimes I'll add that major 9 sound in there. So a lot of these feel like keyboard chords. You've got a triad and then you've got the wrong bass note. So I guess it's a C with an F in the bass. And then this, A flat Steely Dan chord. Call it what you will. I seriously don't care what that chord is called. But it's that one. Going to G13. Make sure you're not playing the A string there, that will kill it. And then let's go to B flat major 7, a bit of a sharp 11 in there for flavouring. And then back to a nice moody E minor chord of some kind. So. The more attentive among you may have noticed that there's one note running through. And that seems like a good trick for making sure weird, random sounding chord progressions do kind of make sense. If there's just one pedal that runs throughout the whole thing, it sounds more like you intended to put the chords in that order, hopefully. Ladies and gentlemen, I have to be honest with you, this is not one of those melodies that I could play to you starting from the 15th note. Really, I can only play it from the first note. So what follows is going to be entertaining, to say the least. But I can show you the rough idea. So it starts with that kind of idea where the two hands are mirroring each other. And for each pair of notes, this hand is leading. So if we look at the tapping lick, it will be easy to lose track of this, but try to bear in mind that you should be able to squeeze 6 of these notes into each beat. So you've got da-ga-da, 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 da-ga-da. So let's try and play the first bit. This is two hands mirroring each other. So it's that kind of shape, and as ever, I'm wasting one of my best fingers by using it to store the pick. If you have a better idea, go for it. But for me, it's mostly these fingers. And then that's an odd bit, because a lot of it looks like fourth intervals or something close to fourth intervals, so I'm having to climb towards the lower strings using the same pair of fingers for a lot of it. So, and then this, and then, so more stacked fourth kind of ideas. You might like that on its own, it's quite intervallic and amusing. That's weird. It feels like the hands change string at the wrong time, but that's how the tune goes. So. That's more mirroring. That's simple enough, that bit. That's some pentatonic shapes on each hand there. Not quite the same thing. On the B string, it's... and then a big pile of fourths and fifths at the end. With regards to this hand, I'm not really one of these TJ Helmerich, Jennifer Batten, full-on 8-finger tapping people. I can't do that. A big part of what I do is about trying to get a big tone and trying to make every note sound as huge as I can. And what seems to work with my hand is if I use 2 fingers at any given time. And the 2 pairings which keep cropping up are the middle and ring fingers together, or the middle and little fingers together. And those 2 pairs seem to work really well. The ring and little finger together will never be as good. I will try and avoid that pair, because I don't think anyone's going to give me an award for trying to fret 2 notes with those fingers. If there's a way to rearrange everything so I can use those 2 or these 2, generally I can make the lick sound good with less gain on the amp. I can get a bigger sounding note and everyone's happier. But it's definitely important to try and get as much force as you can into each one of those fingers and get them feeling as independent as possible.